Now this is started. So the exam is Thursday, Friday, or Monday, Tuesday. You have to take it in the testing center, which is open, I think, from either 8 to 5 or 7 to 5. And so you can't go there at 5. They'll close and they'll leave. It won't work. So you need to start your exam at least 42 minutes before 5 o'clock. That's because the exam is 42 minutes long and it's timed. So you only have 42 minutes to take it. Yes?
How many questions is it?
30. I gave you 2 extra minutes.
Are they multiple choice or?
They are all multiple choice. It's all multiple choice. We'll see. We'll see who's happy. You can ask me. You can ask me. I'm here to. You don't have to ponder it into the You don't have to send those thoughts into the ethos and hope they come back. I'm right here. What do you want to know?
So is it going to be one of those where it's not like which answer's right, it's like which answer's the most not wrong?
I see what you're saying, and kind of, but not. So I do say choose the answer that is most correct, not the answer that isn't not wrong. Yeah. So it's kind of the same way of saying things, but one is more accurate than the other one. So, and there is a right choice for every question within the context of what we've learned. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean there's a lot of the reason why you need to have studied and you need to be organized is because there's a lot of 2 of these are correct, none of these are correct, 3 of these are correct, these types of things, right? And those aren't there to trick you. Those are there because somebody that had studied would know that very quickly and could not waste time looking it up. But if somebody that isn't as well prepared has to look up every one of those possibilities, then it wastes a bunch of time. That's what I'm trying to test. So really, ideally, you should have read your book, listened to the lectures, written out study questions, and then you have your study questions to study. And you know where things are. You know what we covered in week 1, you know what we covered in week 2, you know what we covered in week 3, and you know how those chapters are kind of organized, right? They're all sort of organized with physiologic processes up front and then application on the back end. So if you're seeing a question about resting metabolic rate and the application of what are different ways to measure resting metabolic rate, you should remember, right, that was the application section of week 1. So it's probably going to be in the later half of chapter 1 study questions. See what I'm saying? And then you can find things really quickly. But if you're looking stuff up and stuff like that, you have no choice. You have no chance. But that's the way it is. And this is the world we function in, right? You have to know the facts. You have to be able to navigate in a general sense. You have to be able to speak the language of your topic. What are you guys talking about?
Let's talk about what it was.
You can ask me. I can give you that information. I can give you that information. So in whatever field you guys end up going into, you have to be able to speak the language, but we also always have information at our fingertips, right? So you need to be able to think on your feet. You need to know how to look, how to find things, where things are, where you need to be organized, and you need to be somewhat up to speed, and then you can function. That's what these tests test, I think. They haven't been validated, but I think they are good. All right, what else do you want to know? Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday, 8 to 5, but really 8 to 4, because the testing center closes at 5. And they do an awesome job there, but they are not your guardian or parent or person looking out for you. So if you walk in at 4:45 and say, I need to take this test, they'll get you going on it, and then they'll be like, this testing center closes at 5 and kick you out. It happens every year. Okay? Yeah.
If we've gone through the study questions thoroughly, should we be fine? Why?
Just thinking.
Oh.
If you've or we've.
If we've gone through, if we've gone through the study questions thoroughly and answered them, like the ones you posted, should we be all right?
No, you need to study as well.
Yeah, obviously.
Oh, okay.
But, like,
No, you can't just do the study questions once and read through it once. But if you read it
okay.
and you did the study questions while you read it, because the study questions are in the order that they appear in the book. So that, because the biggest waste of time for students is read this chapter and then you're just reading words on a page and there's nothing actually sticking, right? So the study questions complement the readings. So you read a study question, what is ATP? Then you read in the book until the answer jumps out at you. Then you write it in. Then you read the next question, you go back to the book. Like we talked about this on day one. This is a super efficient way. That's not being mad, that's just the facts. This morning I referenced the first day of class in a different class, and then now this afternoon Kelly told me I was salty or savage? Feisty. No. She did say savage. Okay. These are just the facts. We deal in facts. Okay. So there are 30 questions, 10 questions per week. Not chapter, week. Okay. Because I think in the first, wasn't week 1, chapter 1 and 2? Something like that? Is that true? Anyways, it goes by week. Okay? Not by chapter. So, and what we get through today is the last stuff that we'll get through. The other thing is that I write like 50 questions, all related to the material that is covered in the study questions, and then it just randomly picks 10 of them for each of those sections. Does that make sense? So everybody gets a different test, but all the tests are equal. There's usually some crappy questions, and we'll look at the metrics after we take the test and see which ones were fair or unfair. We'll throw out what's unfair. We'll make those adjustments. Evaluating. It's a process. Okay, what else? Anything else? Okay, Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday. When are you going to do it, Jaden? Tuesday?
I feel comfortable.
Okay. Just depends on if you want your weekend or you study over the weekend. I would definitely be taking it on Tuesday if it were me. I'd be studying over the weekend. But I'm not a good student. Or I wasn't a good student. Okay. We talked about this. I think this is where we left off. So, there's a description of the exam too, as well. If you click on the quiz thing in Canvas, no, that's hidden from you. If you go to assignments, there should be a little exam 1 link. If you click on that, it'll give you a description without starting the actual exam. You can't start it anyways because it's password protected. You don't know the password. Just the people down there do. What's so funny?
She said the American government can hack into it.
Yeah, they probably could.
We're
They probably could. And I'm sure they would want to test their knowledge of performance nutrition. Now, what are you guys talking about? See, these side conversations in a formal meeting may or may not be distracting. Okay, what were you talking about?
Notes.
Yeah. I would encourage you all to study together. By the way, I keep forgetting to tell you all this, but the Learning Center has like a bunch of new programs going on this term where there's like they'll facilitate study groups and like group tutor sessions and stuff like that. You guys know about that? You can study as groups. I mean, everyone's going to get a unique test. You can't work together on the test. But learning happens together. And where people get into trouble, he's like, all right, well, you do this set of study questions, and I'll do this set of study questions, and then we'll swap. Because then you're not in the mix with those study questions. You just skim them. And like I've seen it happen too many times. The wheels come off every time. So, what's that?
Peter and I did that last year. Bad idea.
Bad idea. Every time.
What was that writing?
Okay, so a couple things to think about. Up until this point, we've talked about carbohydrates, how they're metabolized, how they're an important source for energy, how they drive anaerobic glycolysis, which is your and aerobic glycolysis, which are sort of the highest levels of sustainable work output. So when you're talking about complex sports that have mixed sprinting and endurance components and all these different types of things, or things like marathon running or long distance running, where you're sustaining a very high intensity for an extended period of time, carbohydrates, gotta have them, right? Okay, so now let's talk about what this actually looks like. What do people actually eat? What are the numbers? How do we calculate this? And I need you all to pay attention to this very carefully, because when it comes time to doing your diet analysis and actually your diet plan design, these are the numbers that you're going to rely on based on the specific things you're trying to get out of your diet program and workout program, right? And this exercise is actually really applicable because this is information that you would use if you were sitting down with a client, if you were the coach of some sort of athletic team, and you were responsible for giving them quality to semi-quality information about eating healthy. Right? You can use these things. So it's very applicable and it's very useful. All right. So there's a couple things. We talked about how glycogen is super important for energy production, and that we only have about 60 minutes of glycogen, even regardless of our ability level. It's just the amount of power that you're going to be able to produce. That's what makes someone that's faster different than someone that's slower. But the relative effort is going to be the same, and therefore the glycogen is going to come down at a similar rate. Right? So a marathoner that's well trained, that's running 5-minute miles, is going to bring down their glycogen to a similar rate as a marathon runner that's running 8 minutes per mile. Right? Just if they're putting forth the same effort. Okay. Now, yes?
So on the glycogen storage, you say we have roughly an hour. In anatomy, when we went over the same topic, he was saying we have 2 hours. Do you know why he'd say 2 hours instead of the 1?
No, I don't know why. Yeah. Unless, I don't know why. I mean, if you had 2 hours worth of glycogen, you would want to go faster. for one. So I'm talking about, I mean, where the disconnect probably is there is with the relative intensity that the person is performing. Does that make sense? Like if I knew I had to run for 2 hours, I might go out at a different pace than if I knew I had to run at 1 hour. Does that make sense? But if you're talking about, all right, I want to run this marathon as hard as I can, and then I have to realize there's no way I have enough glycogen to last for this whole time. And we see that, I mean, even in application, you see that, right? So do you remember, was it last year or 2 years ago when they put all that, when Nike put all that money into trying to break the 2-hour marathon? You know what I'm talking about? So Nike, it was either last year or 2 years ago, Nike did this thing called the Breaking 2 Project. And they identified some marathon runners, and they basically said, well, we think that if we make the conditions perfect, we can help somebody break 2 hours in the marathon. Right? And this is like something that they've said was physiologically impossible. And in actuality, what people have said, like this guy named Mike Joyner, he's at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, what he has said is if it could potentially be physiologic possible if every variable was controlled for and factored in. And they almost did it. A guy ran 2 hours and I think like 30 seconds or 28 seconds or something like that. He missed it by 30 seconds. So they identified a race course in Italy that was perfectly flat and didn't have turns that were too sharp that would like slow the person down. They picked a time of year and a start time and that had the perfect temperature and the perfect wind patterns. They actually had pacers run with this guy in a flying V formation that they identified through wind tunnel testing that was the most efficient way to break wind around somebody. They also had Tesla driving with like a windshield that had a clock on it. They invented a shoe called the Nike Zoom Fly 4%, which has now become very, very controversial because it's super expensive, and they put a carbon fiber plate in the bottom of it that actually increases your efficiency by 4% over the course of a marathon. So it's like you literally store more energy and it gives you more energy back when you store it. And now it's really controversial because it's like if somebody were to like have a motorized shoe basically or something like that, like nobody would accept that in a race, right? But now like people are wearing those in marathons and PRing by like minutes because of the shoe they're wearing. All of this, they even considered, and I really wish they had done this because it would have been so cool. They even considered putting, lining the entire race course. Do you know about this? Oh, they even considered lining the entire race course on both sides with a wall of ice to keep it cool and to keep it at a constant temperature. That was like not off the table. Like an ice wall that was this thick and like 8 feet high, lining both sides of the race course, right? A former TA of mine, not TA of mine, a former student of mine when I was a TA at Colorado State, was the head physiologist for this project. He works for Nike. And it's pretty much has me to thank for his whole career, I guess, basically. I also introduced him to his wife. So.
How often do they have to change their rabbits?
What?
The Pacers?
Oh, great question. So they had this rotating system with the Pacers so that they never messed up their flying V. And they would just like one or two guys would pop off the back, and they would like swing around, and two more guys would come in, and then they were switching rabbits a lot. Yeah. The point of all this is that if they had enough glycogen to run for 2 hours, it'd be a huge waste of time to take on carbohydrate while they're running, right? Because it breaks their rhythm, breaks their efficiency, all this other type of stuff. And they were drinking carbohydrates the entire time. Now, part of that is what we talked about before. You don't wait till the water is at your ankles before you turn on the spigot, right? You want to keep the checks coming in so you can keep spending. So some of that has to do with the central nervous system. But they definitely weren't out there eating beef jerky or, eating avocados or, like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, when people are like, oh, just, like, get some good protein in and that'll fuel you for your, or, you need a lot of fat to fuel your marathon and stuff like that. If you want to run 10-minute miles, then fat's great. But you don't need to replace it. I mean, we have enough fat to run, like, 50 marathons back to back. From an energy standpoint, it's the carbohydrates that is the limiting factor. So I'm not sure. Yeah. So it's probably intensity related. I mean, those guys are running down in the 420s, I think, per mile, 26 miles. That's not slow. Puma's actually made this little robot that has a camera on it that follows the lines of a track, and you can set it at whatever pace you want to see what different paces feel like. And it's fast enough to do Bolt's 958 for 100 meters. So you can basically see what it would be like if you were racing against Bolt when he broke the world record with this little Puma robot. No, I'm dead serious. But you can use it as a pacer and be like, all right, I want to see how long I could last. I want to know how long I can keep up with this robot running at 2-hour flat marathon pace, right? I bet I could last 150 meters, if that. Good question. Other questions? Okay, so a couple things about this. After training, we are we synthesize glycogen to a greater degree. It's kind of like when you recover from weightlifting, you have that anabolic window, right? We also have an anabolic window for glycogen, and you can store more glycogen if you consume carbohydrates immediately after training, as opposed to waiting an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. All right? And it doesn't appear that you need to completely refill every drop of glycogen. It just appears that you need to get some carbohydrate into the system and get the process going to take advantage of that anabolic window. All right? So 15 to 30 minutes post-exercise, you have the amount of glycogen storage is greater. Why this is important is because one of the reasons why, for example, runners or football players or soccer players or anybody feels flat the day after a big workout, a big reason for that is they didn't replenish their glycogen. Right? One of the reasons why sports nutrition advocates, or performance nutrition best practices advocate taking on carbohydrates immediately after hard workouts is to restore glycogen levels so that you can work out hard again sooner after. Does that make sense? This is particularly important when you have no choice. Now, you can program some of this stuff, right? If you're responsible for it and you're a coach, whatever. But if you're playing soccer games on back-to-back days, or you're playing basketball tournament where you're playing 3 games in 2 days or whatever the case may be. Softball tournaments are like this too, right? Like, you need to keep that in mind. And to avoid that flat feeling, one of the things you can do is take on carbohydrates. All right. So it's, interestingly enough, exercise is sends a lot of what are called anorexigenic signals. So it's an appetite suppressant. Those of you that chose Calm Energy as one of the books that you're going to read this term, know there's data to suggest that a brisk 10-minute walk or 5-minute run when you're feeling hungry is one of the best ways to suppress feelings of hunger. And the higher the intensity of exercise, the more it suppresses your feelings of hunger. Now, that's not later on down the road. That's immediately right when you finish, right? So anybody that's ever run like a cross-country meet all out or just finished a really hard practice or the second practice of a 2-a-day or conditioning session or something like that, the last thing you would want is someone to just like sit down Thanksgiving dinner right in front of you at that moment. See what I'm saying? So you have to find a way to get carbohydrates into the system that's easy on the system and easy to digest. And that's what this point is about. So there's some commercially available drinks that you can use to try and replenish glycogen. You can also rely on things like smoothies. This is the one time when smoothies are in some shape or form acceptable. Right? Now, I still wouldn't say, if you were like a professional athlete that was training really, really hard and trying to maximize every little thing, right? Cross every T, dot every I, I would still say only do smoothies after easier workouts. When you still want sugars, you still want the signal, you still want the insulin spike, you still want the protein. So you put some whey, you put some fruit together, you do it that way, right? But if you're talking about getting things into the system as quickly and easily as possible, then those fruits are going to have quite a bit of fiber and other micronutrients and things like that that are kind of, I'm not going to say distracting, but whatever. They're not as efficient as something like Gatorade or just sugar like that, right? Okay, so the guys that wrote Nutrient Timing, they actually invented a drink based on their research about glycogen and protein synthesis recovery, and that's, I labeled it here, it's this drink called Endurox R4, and a lot of endurance athletes kind of, I won't say swear by it, but they use it. Now, one of the issues with the Endurox one is it's a 4-to-1 glucose to protein ratio. So, if you need 15 grams of protein, then you're taking on 60 grams of carbohydrate, which all told is close to 300 calories when you take the protein and the carbohydrates together. Again, this is not appropriate after you crush the elliptical for 15 or 20 minutes at, conversation pace. Do you understand? All right. The other thing is 3-to-1 ratio appears to also be effective, and it's a way to shave back a few calories. So some endurance athletes will go towards that, the 3-to-1 ratio as opposed to the 4-to-1 ratio, and it seems to work. Okay? So the simpler the carbohydrate and the more absorbable the source of protein, the better for the post-workout state. And these are things that are not appropriate outside of workout times. So when you're in the middle of your run and you're trying to keep the checks coming in, you want simple carbohydrates, right? You're not going to whip out a chicken leg covered in honey glaze and eat it while you're running, right? You're going to do gels and blocks and, see what I'm saying? Even though that sounds pretty good. Okay, so the point of this figure this is a really important figure, is to demonstrate the variety and expansiveness, if you will, of a response to an exercise stress. Okay? And the reason why figures like this are important is because too often we become myopic in regards to the thing that we're learning about in the moment, and we stop and we tend to forget all these other really important physiologic processes that are happening simultaneously that are also critical to the context of the situation that an athlete may be in. Do you understand? Okay. And so it's a very kind of complex equation or problem-solving situation, and what works under one condition might not work under another condition, because depending on the conditions, it's going to change this level of stress. Right? So even though this stress is one box, we can think of so many different things that would in some way potentially alter the downstream responses of this. Right? So we think of stress like, I have a test this week stress that's going to affect things in a particular way. We also think of stress as being, is it resistance training? Was it endurance training? Was it high intensity? What was the volume? Is it hot? Is it cold? What are the conditions, other conditions that I'm dealing with, right? Am I cycling? Am I swimming? Am I running? Am I lifting? Am I playing basketball, soccer? All these, every single one of those is a different type of stress that leads to sort of different response. Now, what's interesting and what I like about the book in terms of this is that it demonstrates how the feedback that we get from the periphery and from our perceptions, right? Things that we see, situations that we're under, heat that we're feeling, sweat that we're producing, tells the brain, these are the conditions that you're under. And that leads to a hormonal response that alters outcomes, especially in terms of fuel utilization. Okay? And other physiologic processes. So we can sense those stresses, this pace. Can I meet this pace using fat? That would be really advantageous so that when I need to step on the gas, I have more carbohydrate ready to go. These types of things, right? So let's just walk through this. Your hypothalamus in your brain senses this. You activate sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight system, that activates your adrenal medulla. This releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are what type of hormones? Catabolic. Catabolic hormones. That means they're interested in breaking down tissue to generate energy to produce work, right? That means, is protein synthesis going to be up during when epinephrine and norepinephrine are in the system? Negative. My kids have started saying negatory and affirmatory for things. So they'll be like, Dad, whatever. Can I have some more chocolate? Negative. And the 2-year-old goes, affirmative. Shit. Affirmative. And then somehow they added the atory to it. I didn't teach them that one. Negatory. Affirmatory. Okay. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are these catabolic hormones, and they're not just acting at the tissue, they're also acting in the brain. Right? They're causing vasoconstriction in our blood vessels that increases blood pressure. They're activating beta-adrenergic receptors in the heart that increase our heart rate. They are activating signals in the brain that stimulate fight or flight responses. All right? So then we get these outcomes. Constricted blood vessels. We shunt blood to our skin so that we can radiate heat and regulate core body temperature. we dilate blood vessels in the muscles and in the brain so we can continue to think clearly and we can deliver more oxygen to the exercising muscles. How cool is this? Right? So I start running and it goes, well, the legs are the system that's using the most work. Let's shut down blood flow to places that don't need it and increase blood flow to the places that do. Right? So we have decreased blood flow to our stomach. We have decreased blood flow to some other organs. We have decreased blood flow to, our hands and fingers and things that aren't doing anything while we're running, so that we can get more oxygen and more nutrients and take away more waste to the muscles that are exercising. Later on, we'll talk about a supplement that increases local production of nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator that supersedes the signaling from epinephrine and norepinephrine. So while the rest of your body is under vasoconstriction, your exercising muscles produce nitric oxide locally, and it opens up those blood vessels locally. So the hoses are all constricted and blood flow is way increased until it hits your legs, and then it opens up to this nice 6-lane highway, and all that blood and all those nutrients get to be distributed. All right? Increases cardiac output. Cardiac output, of course, is stroke volume times heart rate. All right? So increase heart rate, maintain stroke volume, you increase cardiac output. You stimulate the conversion of glycogen to glucose with epinephrine and norepinephrine. What's the other hormone we talked about that is a catabolic hormone, counter-regulatory to insulin, that stimulates glycogen breakdown? Glucagon. Okay? And then look at this. Run longer. Fight harder. Who doesn't want that? Huh? All right. Other parts of the hypothalamus go through the pituitary axis that also affect the adrenal cortex. And this releases a hormone called cortisol. Who has heard of cortisol? Yeah. Cortisol is important, and it has an important role in an acute sense during exercise. Okay? And cortisol is responsible for fat breakdown and gluconeogenesis. But when we get stressed out and our brain perceives some sort of threat to us, and then it releases cortisol. So this is, we can actually measure cortisol in our saliva, in acute cortisol production in our saliva. So they've done like really cool studies where they've shown like a high pressure penalty kick or a high pressure free throw produces different levels of cortisol, and people that can like control and stay calm and alter their perception of what's occurring around them have better motor function because of these different, that's all taking place perceptually. Right? Okay, so, and you can stress people out, their cortisol goes through the roof, and long-term chronic cortisol production will eat away skeletal muscle, it will cause all these other kind of detrimental effects, right? But under exercise conditions, we release cortisol, mobilizes fats, provides nutrients for cellular respiration, it helps convert, it turns on gluconeogenesis. In the short term, it reduces inflammation. In the long term, it's considered a marker of chronic inflammation. Okay? Hormonal responses that lead to changes in nutrient use. Okay? Elevated blood sugar, increased ability to run long, fight hard, due to the effects of these hormones. It's important to appreciate these because hormones are acting as signals, and when we regulate the use of carbohydrate, we can produce energy, we can meet exercise demands, and we're also providing feedback to the brain about the status of the system. Okay? All right, carbohydrate recommendations. Here's the thing. Here's the thing about carbohydrate. It's gonna vary based on the individual, and it should be modulated based on how hard the individual is working on any given day. Remember, we talked about way back that you can't just eat a side of cow if you're deficient in protein. You can't eat a bowl of Crisco if you're deficient in fat. But you can go a long period of time without eating carbohydrates. Now, will your performance suffer as a result of not having carbohydrates in the system? The answer is yes. But can we get it back within one meal? The answer is also yes. Okay? We need the general recommendations for just a free living adult is about 130 grams of carbohydrate per day, regardless of body size or weight. All right. Now, when we talk about protein, we talk about fat, what we're going to see is that the recommendations are going to be in a gram per kilogram body weight recommendation. But with carbohydrates, the general recommendation is just this flat 130 grams. And the reason for that is they say that's about the amount of carbohydrate that your brain will burn through in a 24-hour period. That's just an estimate based off of that. Right? So we want to have a sharp central nervous system. Our brains like carbohydrate. But that is a low amount of carbohydrate. 130 grams is not a lot. Right? You're talking about a piece of bread has almost 40 grams of carbohydrate to it. So you're talking about 3 pieces of bread a day. That's not a lot of carbohydrate. Right? Now, you can modulate carbohydrate based on the needs of the individual. So the way they do it in Table 4.4 is they give a gram per kilogram body weight recommendation starting low and going higher. All right? And the lower, the less endurance activity you're doing, the less carbohydrate you need. Now, do you need some carbohydrate? Of course. Especially if you're running the 400, if you're running the 800, you need carbohydrates in the system because we want that energy. We want that energy availability. We also want the brain to know, hey, it doesn't know you're only going to run a half a mile or a quarter mile. Does that make sense? Maybe it does. I say that a lot, but I don't actually have a study. Most of what I say, I have a study that I could point to where that came from. I don't have a study that says that. Anyways. Okay, so if you're participating in high-intensity endurance activity that is over 30 minutes per day, then you're going to end up getting about 5 to 8 grams per kilogram. And if you're doing something like 6 to 10 miles of running as an elite runner, so the example here is somebody that's running 30 minutes or is running 10K in under 30 minutes. That's very quick. It's 6.2 miles in sub 5-minute pace. That type of individual is going to require a higher carbohydrate. These are daily carbohydrate recommendations. The other way that you could go about doing this, if you were to, when you make your plan, is you can say, you know what, I'm going to start with like a 1 to 2, maybe even 2.5 grams per kilogram for base carbohydrates. And then I'm going to modulate carbohydrates depending on my workout for that day. Right? So that means you're going to eat a bunch of carbohydrates before you go out to your workout. Then you're going to do your workout, burn a certain number of calories. If you have an estimate of that, say through a heart rate monitor or through a calorie calculator or something like that, then you can kind of know, like, all right, this is how much carbohydrate I need to replace to restore glycogen, make the system happy. But you don't want to overconsume carbohydrate, because if you overconsume carbohydrate, it's fat sparing. Do you understand that? So when we overconsume carbohydrates, it's not that the carbohydrate is turning to fat. It's that your body would rather use the carbohydrates than the fat. So too much carbohydrate ends up being fat sparing, And when you're in excess caloric balance plus an excess of carbohydrates, then you're in a situation where you never have to rely on fat as a fuel. It's fat sparing. Does that make sense? All right. Listen, real quick. The rest of these slides are just tables of like basic recommendations, all right? So this is daily carbohydrate consumption. These are sources of carbohydrates that you can take on during exercise. This is the amount of carbohydrate you need to take on per hour of hard exercise, right? So right before this class, I was talking to a professional marathoner, and we were talking about making sure that he got enough carbohydrate per hour, and we were talking in these kinds of numbers, right? 60 to 80 grams per hour. And if you have that number, then you can go like, all right, well, 60 grams is 3 gels. That's 1 gel every 20 minutes. How many am I going to need per long run? How am I going to set this up? Where are my aid stations going to be? How can I plan this? And there's some real thought that can go into this so that you can maintain that performance through things, right? And that's all. There's some carbohydrate loading stuff that we can talk about if you guys have questions about it, but I'm not going to go into detail about it. And then they just have some examples of carbohydrate-rich foods. Okay? And that's basically what I wanted to talk about with carbohydrates. Wednesday and Friday, 3 to 5.